getting at here is all this stuff here, if you're lying about it. It's extremely easy for us to prove that you're lying about it because we can test DNA.
Some love stories begin with passion, dreams, and promises that feel unbreakable. They look perfect from the outside. Friends admire them. Families believe they have found something rare. Social media shows smiling faces, romantic photos, and messages about loyalty and forever. But sometimes, the most beautiful love stories hide something dark beneath the surface. Sometimes the relationship everyone believes in becomes the setting for a tragedy that no one could have imagined. In the Philippines, one case shocked the entire nation because it began like a modern love story and ended in a nightmare. It was a relationship filled with affection, jealousy, arguments, apologies, and eventually violence. A story involving two young people whose lives became permanently connected in the worst possible way. This is the disturbing story of Cochise-Beebom and Crystal Abellana, a case often referred to as the Cochise-Beebom tragedy. The story begins like many modern romances. Cochise-Beebom was known among friends as energetic, friendly, and passionate about life. He was a young Filipino man who enjoyed spending time with friends, sharing moments online, and building a future for himself. He met Crystal Abellana during a time when both were navigating young adulthood, relationships, and the pressures of everyday life. At first, their relationship seemed normal. They spent time together, shared photos, and appeared happy. Friends described them as a couple deeply involved in each other's lives. Like many young relationships, their story was documented through messages, pictures, and posts online. But behind the scenes, things were not always perfect. Arguments became more frequent. Jealousy began creeping into the relationship. Those close to them later recalled moments where tensions were clearly growing. The couple would fight, separate briefly, then reconcile again. To outsiders, it looked like a dramatic but typical relationship between two young people still learning about love. But emotions were building beneath the surface, and eventually, those emotions would explode. The events that changed everything occurred in 2021 in the Philippines. On what seemed like an ordinary day, Cochise and Crystal were together again, but the meeting quickly turned into a heated confrontation. Witness accounts and later reports suggested that the couple began arguing intensely. The argument escalated rapidly, fueled by jealousy and unresolved resentment from past conflicts. Arguments in relationships are common, but this one would end in violence. During the confrontation, Crystal Abellana allegedly attacked Cochise-Beebom with a knife. The attack was sudden and brutal. Cochise was stabbed during the struggle. The young man who had once shared affectionate photos and messages with Crystal was now fighting for his life. Emergency responders were called, but the injuries were severe. Cochise-Beebom died from the stabbing. In a single moment, a relationship that had once been built on love turned into a homicide investigation. News of the incident spread quickly across the Philippines. People were stunned. Many had followed the couple's relationship online. Seeing their pictures together made the tragedy even more disturbing. The idea that a love story could end with one partner killing the other was difficult for many people to understand. Police quickly began investigating the case. Crystal Abellana was identified as the primary suspect in Cochise's death. Authorities gathered witness statements, examined the crime scene, and tried to reconstruct what had happened during the fatal argument. As details emerged, the public reaction grew stronger. Some people expressed anger and demanded justice for Cochise. Others tried to understand what could drive someone to commit such an act. The case sparked intense discussions online about toxic relationships, emotional instability, and the warning signs of violent behavior. But beyond the public debates, investigators focused on the facts. They examined the timeline leading up to the stabbing. They reviewed messages and communications between the couple. They spoke with friends and relatives who had observed the relationship. Many described a partnership that had become increasingly unstable. Arguments had reportedly grown more intense over time. Jealousy and emotional confrontations were becoming more frequent. Those patterns often appear in relationships that eventually turn dangerous. Experts in criminal psychology often say that violent crimes within relationships rarely happen without warning signs. Emotional volatility, possessiveness, repeated conflicts, and unresolved resentment can slowly build into explosive situations. In the Cochise-Beebom case, many observers later believed those warning signs had been present, but like many troubled relationships, the signs were easy to ignore until it was too late. The tragedy forced many young Filipinos to confront uncomfortable questions about relationships and emotional control. Why do some relationships become toxic? Why do people stay in situations that clearly cause emotional pain? And most importantly, How can conflicts escalate so far that one person ends up taking another's life? As the investigation continued, authorities worked to ensure that the case would move through the justice system. Crystal Abellana was taken into custody as the legal process began. For Cochise's family, the grief was overwhelming. Losing a loved one is always painful, but losing someone to violence creates a different kind of trauma. The questions never seem to end. What exactly happened during those final moments? Could the tragedy have been prevented? And why did a relationship built on love end with a knife? Friends and relatives remembered Cochise-Beebom as someone full of life. Social media posts honoring him described his kindness, humor, and loyalty to those around him. Many people struggled to accept that such a vibrant young life had been taken so suddenly. The case quickly became one of the most widely discussed relationship tragedies in the Philippines. Part of the reason was how relatable it seemed. Unlike many criminal cases involving strangers, this was a story about a couple. Two people who once cared for each other. Two people who once shared dreams. That made the crime feel even more disturbing, because it reminded everyone of a frightening reality. Sometimes the most dangerous conflicts happen between people who once loved each other deeply. In the years since the tragedy, the Cochise-Beebom case has continued to be discussed in conversations about relationship violence. It is often used as an example of how emotional instability and unresolved anger can escalate into irreversible decisions. Experts often emphasize that violent relationships usually show warning signs long before physical harm occurs. Constant jealousy, controlling behavior, repeated explosive arguments, emotional manipulation. These patterns can slowly transform love into something destructive. Unfortunately, many couples ignore those signals until the situation becomes dangerous. The death of Cochise-Beebom forced many people to reflect on these issues. It also highlighted the importance of emotional awareness and conflict management in relationships. Love alone is not enough to sustain a healthy partnership. Respect, communication, and emotional stability are just as important. Without them, even the most passionate relationships can collapse, and sometimes they collapse in devastating ways. Today, the Cochise-Beebom case remains one of the most shocking relationship tragedies in recent Philippine discussions. It is remembered not only for the crime itself, but for the lessons it revealed about human emotions. Love can be powerful, but when jealousy, anger, and obsession take control, that same love can become something dangerous. The story also reminds people how quickly life can change. One argument, one moment of uncontrolled rage, one irreversible decision, and suddenly everything is gone. Families are left grieving, friends are left searching for answers, and a love story becomes a crime scene. As time passed after the tragedy, the story of Cochise-Beebom did not simply disappear from public memory. In many ways, the case continued to grow in impact because people began looking deeper into what the relationship had been like before the fatal day. Friends of Cochise began sharing stories about his personality and the way he treated the people around him. Many described him as someone who loved spending time with friends, laughing and creating memories. He was the kind of person who could easily bring energy into a room. That made the shock of his death even harder for people to accept. Meanwhile, discussions about Crystal Abellana also intensified. People began debating whether the tragedy was the result of uncontrollable anger, emotional instability, or the buildup of long-standing conflict between the couple. Social media became a major space where the story continued unfolding. Old photos of the couple circulated online. Videos and posts that once showed them smiling together were now viewed in a completely different light. What once looked like a happy relationship now seemed filled with hidden tension to those looking back. Many young people in the Philippines started discussing the case as a warning about the dangers of toxic relationships. Conversations about jealousy, emotional control, and unresolved conflict became more common. Some people began encouraging friends to recognize early warning signs in relationships that might be turning unhealthy. Psychologists often explain that emotional escalation in relationships rarely happens overnight. It grows slowly through repeated arguments, mistrust, and unresolved anger. When those emotions are ignored for long enough, they can eventually explode in ways that no one expected. The Cochise-Beebom tragedy forced many people to confront that reality. What made the story even more painful was the fact that it did not involve strangers or criminals meeting in dark alleyways. It involved two people who once cared deeply about each other. That contrast between love and violence is what continues to disturb those who remember the case. Years later, the story still circulates in discussions about relationship violence and emotional responsibility. It serves as a powerful reminder that passion alone cannot sustain a healthy relationship. Trust must be protected, respect must be maintained, and anger must be controlled before it grows into something destructive. Because sometimes, the most heartbreaking tragedies are not caused by enemies. Sometimes they happen between two people who once called each other everything. The tragedy of Cochise-Beebom is ultimately a reminder that relationships carry immense emotional power. Handled with care, that power can create lifelong bonds. But when emotions spiral out of control, the consequences can be devastating. A young man lost his life. A young woman lost her future. Two families were left with permanent scars, and a love story that once seemed hopeful ended in the most heartbreaking way imaginable. It began with affection. It ended with violence. And it left behind a question that still echoes in the minds of many people who followed the case. How did love turn into tragedy?